HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Light Beyond the Trenches, an unforgettable novel of World War I by Hlad, read by Peter Noble. Part 1. Prelude. Chapter 1. Ypres, Belgium, April 20th, 1915. On the eve of the war crime, Max Benesch was crouched in a trench on the Western Front. The shelling had paused, and the battlefield was calm, except for sporadic barks of machine guns. He joined a small group of his fellow German soldiers who were gathered around a metal container, reminiscent of a tarnished milk can. Taking turns, they scooped tins of watered-down potato soup, laced with specks of beef sinew. Max, a tall, lean man with hair and eyes the colour of chestnuts, took a spoonful of soup, bland and cold. He looked at Jakob, a haggard, boyish-faced soldier. "The war will soon be over, and you'll be devouring Sauerbraten and Spätzle." Jakob, his eyes dark with fatigue, smiled and spooned a bit of soup. The trench, a 3-metre deep by 2-metre wide excavation, stretched for over 20 kilometres through the Belgian area of Flanders, creating a semicircular front line. The Imperial German Army had acquired higher ground, and they had the Allies, French, British, Canadian and Belgian troops, partially surrounded. But the transport of soldiers to the Eastern Front to fight the Russians had depleted German forces. Both sides were dug in. Between them ran 200 metres of no man's land, a barren field scarred with shell holes, barbed wire, and mud. And despite artillery bombardments, ground attacks, and an escalating death toll, the Ypres battlefield remained a stalemate. Max, a 24-year-old Jewish German soldier, had arrived at the front 6 months earlier. Prior to entering the military, he had attended the Royal Conservatory of Music of Leipzig. A pianist and aspiring composer, he dreamed of someday performing at the great hall of the Musikverein in Vienna. But his ambition was placed on hold when war erupted in Europe. For Max and many other Jews, serving Germany created hope of being treated equal to non-Jewish Germans for the first time. However, Max was discouraged to learn that Jewish soldiers were limited in rank and could only become officers of the reserve, not the regular army. Regardless of his education and combat training performance, he was given the position of a Soldat, the lowest rank of enlisted men in the army, and he was assigned to the front. The initial weeks in the trenches were nearly intolerable for Max. The muddy, rat-infested conditions were abhorrent, spawning influenza, typhus, and trench foot. Artillery cannons perpetually boomed. The ground quaked. Shrapnel whistled through the air. He'd witnessed men, some of whom he'd befriended, die in battle. A looming sense of dread, knowing that he could be maimed or killed at any moment, haunted him like a shadow. Under a rain of shellfire, it was luck, not valor or skill, that determined who would live or die. As weeks had turned to months, Max learned to accept that there was only so much he could do to influence his fate. "Keep my head down," he told himself, crawling under a hail of machine gun fire. He hoped that he could endure 6 more months. After reaching his 1-year anniversary on the front, he would receive a 2-week leave, and he'd go home to his fiancée, Wilhelmina. He longed to see her and wrote to her often, but his deep-seated will to survive wasn't solely driven by the hope of reuniting with her. It was fueled by the death of his parents, Franz and Katharina. Max's parents had perished in the sinking of the Baron Gauch, a passenger ship that sank in the northern Adriatic Sea at the onset of the war, after running into a minefield laid by the Austro-Hungarian Navy. 127 passengers and crew members died in the sinking of the ship, and his parents' bodies were never recovered. He prayed that they didn't suffer. Heartbroken, he often viewed a photograph taken of him and his parents at a piano performance in Leipzig, which he kept in his Soldaten leather wallet, alongside a picture of Wilhelmina. "Do I make you proud?" he would often silently ask. "Will I be forgiven for what I am required to do?" After closing his wallet, he would return to his duties, resolved to live another day, and another day after that. Max sipped his soup, to the squelching of footsteps approaching in the muddy trench. "Disinfection unit," Jakob said, nudging Max. Max looked up. A moustached Oberleutnant stopped and directed 2 soldiers following him. One of the soldiers used a wind gauge, which was attached to a pole and raised high in the air, while the other inspected a grouping of large metal cylinders, partially buried in the base of the trench. The officer recorded notes on a clipboard. Their unit had routinely traversed the area, but the frequency of their inspections had increased over the past few days. Max and his comrades lowered their spoons. Their meal conversation faded. Otto, a stout soldier with a lantern jaw, called to the officer, "Is there anything we can do to help, sir?" "Nein," the officer said, in a hoarse, bass voice. He scribbled on his paper. Otto lowered his head. Weeks ago, several thousand metal cylinders were installed along the trench lines by a special squad called the Disinfection Unit. The cylinders were buried, except for their tops, into the base of the trench, like giant iron carrots. Rubber hoses attached to the cylinder valves ran up and over the trench. At the end of the hoses were lead nozzles, which faced the enemy line. Although the handling of the cylinders was the responsibility of the Disinfection Unit, Max had come to the aid of a unit member who was struggling to lug a cylinder to a hole. The thigh-high canister weighed nearly 40 kilograms, Max estimated, and it appeared to contain some kind of gas. Rumors about the cylinders spread through trenches, especially when a few privileged officers were speculated to have received some type of breathing apparatus used for miners. But as days and weeks passed, the soldiers, who were toiling to stay alive, paid less and less attention to the idle cylinders. The moustached officer recorded another wind reading, and then disappeared with his men down the trench. "They work hard to keep their duties a secret," said Heinrich, a wiry soldier from Cologne who loved to play cards. "Maybe the cylinders contain disinfectant for lice," Jakob said. "I don't think so," Max said. "The nozzles are pointed toward the enemy, and they're measuring the speed and direction of the wind." Jakob shrugged. "Maybe the French have worse lice than us," Otto said, grinning. A few of the men chuckled, but the jesting abruptly faded. Whatever is inside the cylinders cannot be good. Max stirred his soup, and he wished that the heavy spring rains would return, burying the cylinders and the entire Western Front under a river of mud. Jakob finished his food and turned to Max. "Do you think the farmhouse that we visited on our leave has been destroyed by shellfire?" "I don't know," Max said, surprised by his friend's inquiry. "On our next day off," Otto said, "we need to go there, assuming it's still standing." "Ja," Heinrich said, wiggling his fingers. "Max plays the piano beautifully." Max smiled. 3 weeks earlier, Max's unit had been given a 24-hour leave. Heinrich, who had won several bottles of schnapps in a card game with a neighbouring trench unit, suggested that they find a secluded spot to drink his winnings. They settled on a vacant farmhouse, which had been partially bombed by Allied infantry. The house was empty, except for a broken sofa and an upright piano, which was likely too heavy for the fleeing family to take with them. After a meal of roasted quail, thanks to Otto's marksmanship, the men urged Max to play the piano. Placing his hands on the ivory keys resurrected fond memories of his parents, who had encouraged his dreams of someday becoming a professional pianist. He began with some of his favourite pieces, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata and Mozart's Rondo alla Turca. His friends applauded and urged him to play more songs. Desiring for his comrades to participate, Max turned his selections to German marches and pieces with lyrics, even though he rarely, if ever, performed them. With full bellies and light hearts, the men gathered around the piano. They drank, passing the bottles, which they slid across the top of the piano. Spilled schnapps turned the piano keys sticky. Max played. The men sang. And for the first time in months, they were joyful. Otto finished his soup and wiped his mouth with his sleeve. "You're a superb pianist." "Danke," Max said, feeling grateful for the compliment. Otto nudged Max with his elbow. "But I would stick to playing marches. People would pay to hear them." Max nodded. The men cleared their tins and gathered their rifles. Otto and Heinrich made their way to a dugout, a protective cave carved into the side of the trench, while Max waited for Jakob, who was on his knees, with an ear pressed to a dry section of ground. "What are you doing?" Max asked. "Listening for tunnelers," Jakob said. Max's heart sank. An image of a German-occupied hill, exploding in a mountainous fountain of earth, iron, and bodies, flashed in his head. He shook away his thought and said, "You have little to worry about." "The 1,000 men who were blown to pieces on the ridge probably thought the same thing," Jakob said. "If British miners are capable of tunnelling into the highest point in German territory and loading an underground chamber with explosives, they can surely reach our location." For months we feared death raining down from the sky, Max thought. Now we worry about wrath rising from hell. He approached Jakob and extended his hand. "They won't tunnel under us." "How do you know?" Jakob asked. "They want the high ground. Our position is on one of the lowest areas of the line." "Are you sure?" "Yeah," Max lied, hoping to quell his friend's angst. Jakob clasped Max's hand and stood. The tension in his brows softened. Max patted him on the shoulder. "Join me. I'm going to write a letter to Wilhelmina. You should write one for your Mutter." "All right," Jakob said. Reaching the dugout, they found Heinrich standing near the makeshift door, which was constructed from a tattered piece of canvas. Several soldiers, strapping their helmets to their heads, rushed down the trench. "What's happening?" Jakob asked. Heinrich removed his helmet and ran a hand through his oily hair. "The infantry's been given orders to conduct a 48-hour bombardment." Jakob's shoulders slumped. "When?" "Tonight," Heinrich said. A prelude to an infantry attack, Max thought. Every soldier on the front knew that a ground attack followed a sustained bombardment. Soon he and his comrades would be ordered by pistol-wielding officers to climb out of the trenches and run into battle. Burying his apprehension, he opened the canvas door and gestured to Jakob. "Letters." The men spoke little for the next few hours. They hunkered in their bunks to either rest, read, or write. Under the flickering flame of a Hindenburg Licht, a flat bowl filled with wax-like fat and a short wick, Max retrieved a paper and pencil. By evening he finished his letter to Wilhelmina and sealed it in an envelope. Jakob, who appeared to be having difficulty concentrating on anything other than the impending battle, struggled to draft a message to his Mutter. Seeking a bit of fresh air before having to spend 48 hours hunkered in a cramped, timber-lined hole, Max left the dugout. The sky was dark except for a crescent moon. The scent of burnt tobacco pervaded his nose. Along the trench, helmets shimmered with moonlight. Cigarette embers glowed and faded like fireflies. As he glanced to his luminous dial watch, German artillery guns exploded. Within seconds, the boom of guns swelled into a unified, ferocious thunder. Red spheres pierced the sky. French rockets shot up light flares with attached parachutes, which slowly drifted to the ground. The flares burned for a minute, turning night into day. Showers of white and red stars filled the atmosphere. Soon French artillery guns fired. Above Max, the air was permeated with shrills and whistles. Adrenaline surged through his veins. Explosions behind German lines trembled the ground beneath his feet. The acrid scent of gunpowder grew. Fear rippled through him. A wave of Allied shells exploded one after another in close proximity, compelling him to press his body to the side of the trench. As he turned to run for the dugout, a concussive blast detonated, knocking him to the ground. A high-pitched ringing buzzed in his ears. As the fog cleared from his head, a loud hissing, like a ruptured steam radiator, emanated from the vicinity of the dugout. Coughs and screams turned his blood cold. A stench of pineapple and pepper burned his nostrils. An overhead flare illuminated the trench, revealing a ruptured cylinder, spewing a green-yellow vapor. "Jakob!" Max struggled to stand. "Heinrich! Otto!" The mist swelled and rolled through the trench. His comrades scrambled from the dugout and were engulfed in thick gas. Max staggered forward. Jakob, gasping and choking, collapsed to his belly, as if he were drowning in a green sea. Heinrich and Otto flailed on the ground. Froth spewed from their mouths. Max, attempting to help his friends, lunged forward. Although he held his breath and covered his nose and mouth with his arm, the gas scorched his lungs. His eyes burned as if he'd been doused with acid. Tears streamed from beneath his closed eyelids. He retreated, stumbling blindly. His lungs heaved, desperate to expel the poison and refresh his body with oxygen. Unable to outrun the gas, he scrambled to climb out of the trench. Suffocating, he frantically clawed his hands over rock and soil. He gagged and choked. Pressing upward, he prayed for air. Part 2. Gavotte. Chapter 2. Oldenburg, Germany, April 17th, 1916. Anna Zeller, a 23-year-old Red Cross nurse with blonde hair, a dimpled chin, and eyes the hue of cornflower, stuffed a bundle of bandages into her apron and maneuvered her way through the overcrowded hospital ward. Groans, coughs, and rasps penetrated the room. She and a team of nurses and doctors exhausted from working double shifts, labored to keep pace with the growing number of injured soldiers. "Emmy," Anna said, passing a young nurse with coarse black hair peeking from underneath her headcloth. "Morphia, bed 11. Emmy nodded and darted to a supply station. The large room was filled with scores of single metal frame beds, each containing an injured soldier. The beds were spaced an arm length apart, allowing enough room for the nurses to navigate the ward. Despite an open window, the air reeked of sweat, carbolic, and gangrene. Several nurses, wearing blue and white striped dresses with white aprons, cared for the men, all of whom had come from the Western Front. The nurses treated a vast scope of battlefield injuries: bullet and shrapnel wounds, burns, missing limbs, mutilated bodies, exposure to poison gas, infections, fractures, head injuries. Each day more injured men were transported to the hospital, where doctors and nurses waged their own battle, repairing the bodies of broken men. "I'm Anna," she said, reaching the bedside of a trembling soldier with a turban-like field dressing wrapped around his head. "Possible skull fracture," she thought. "Can you tell me your name?" The soldier cracked open his swollen eyelids. "Johann," he wheezed. "You're going to be all right, Johann." Emmy, holding a hypodermic syringe, arrived at the bed. "My friend Emmy is going to give you an injection of morphia to soothe your pain," Anna said. "A doctor will examine you, and then I'll clean and rebandage your wound." He groaned and placed his hands to his temples. Emmy touched his arm. He flinched. "It's okay," Anna said, softening her voice. "I'll hold your hands while Emmy administers the medicine." She gently clasped his fingers, lowered his arms to his side, and then nodded to Emmy. Emmy injected the morphia. He squeezed Anna's hands. His fingernails, blackened with dirt from the trenches, dug into her palms. As his breathing slowed and his muscles relaxed, Anna released his hands. She turned to Emmy and whispered, "I couldn't do this without you." Emmy, her eyes darkened with fatigue, drew a faint smile and left to tend to another patient. Anna delicately unwrapped the soldier's field dressing, all the while praying that his cranium was intact. Anna, determined to do her patriotic duty, began working at the hospital when the war erupted. The initial days as a nurse were strenuous for her. The yowls of men suffering excruciating pain rattled her nerves. Her hands trembled while dispensing medicine, and the duty of cleaning infected wounds turned her stomach. Also, the technical aspects of nursing had not come easily for Anna, who needed more practice to master tasks, such as the precise measuring of drugs and the insertion of needles. To compound matters, the hospital was short-staffed, due to a number of doctors and nurses who were transferred to field hospitals. Therefore, the staff in Oldenburg often worked double shifts. When she wasn't laboring in the hospital ward, or taking a brief rest on one of the cots in the basement boiler room, she went home, which she shared with her Vater, Norby, and collapsed onto her bed. As months passed, Anna gradually grew accustomed to the stressful hospital environment, as well as more proficient at her duties. "I need to be strong for them," she'd told herself, while replacing a dressing over a severed leg. Although her father had raised her to be a pacifist, and she deeply loathed the war, Anna believed she was doing something good by serving as a nurse. However, much of her mending of bodies felt provisional, considering the bleak features of permanently disabled men. Who will care for them after they leave the hospital? She often wondered. How will they survive on their own? Her heart ached for the soldiers, whose bodies and souls were savaged by war, and she wished that there was more that she could do to improve their quality of life. After a frenzied morning of caring for patients, Anna joined Emmy for a brief meal break on a bench in the hospital garden. Although the vegetation was dormant, the weather was brisk and a welcome change from the dank hospital air. "How is our patient in bed 11? Emmy asked. "Surgery won't be needed," Anna said, unwrapping a hunk of bread. She broke it in half and gave a piece to Emmy. "He might make a full recovery." "It's your bedside manner that makes them well," Emmy said. "Danke," Anna said. "But everyone knows that I'm one of the least technically adept nurses on the floor." "Doesn't matter," Emmy said. "There's more to medicine than picking shrapnel from wounds. You give them compassion and hope." Anna smiled, feeling appreciative for her friend's kind words. She took a bite of bread and turned her thoughts to Emmy's husband, who was serving as an army medic at the front. "How's Ewald?" "I received a letter from him yesterday," Emmy said. "His spirits are good, although I know he would never tell me otherwise." "I'm sure he's safe and well," Anna said. Emmy picked at her bread. "I can't stop worrying about him." "I feel the same way about Bruno." Anna rubbed Emmy's arm. "We must have faith that the war will end, and they'll come home." "Yeah." Emmy blinked her eyes, fending off tears. Anna met Bruno, an army officer with an arm fracture, soon after she began working at the hospital. He was one of her first patients. Despite the ugly cast she had created for him out of plaster-soaked bandages, he asked to see her after he was released from the hospital. She initially declined, but after his numerous requests, including 2 that were written in the form of a poorly constructed poem, she agreed. Bruno stayed in an Oldenburg boarding house for his entire 3-week medical leave, rather than return home to his family in Frankfurt. Although they had different upbringings, Anna's Vater was a humble clockmaker, and Bruno's family owned a large dye manufacturing business. She was smitten by his charm. The day before he returned to the front, he proposed. She accepted, and they planned to marry after the war, which they both suspected would be in a matter of months. But months turned into a year, and now, nearly 2 years into the war, there appeared to be no end to the conflict in sight. As Anna and Emmy finished their lunch, a bespectacled doctor with fine, stubbled grey hair entered the garden. In one hand he held a leash, tethered to a German shepherd. Using his free arm, he guided a battlefield-blinded soldier who was staring ahead and shuffling his feet. "It's kind of Dr. Stalling to bring his dog to the hospital," Anna said. "It enlivens the patients." "Yeah," Emmy said. "I wonder how many dogs he has at home." "Why do you say that?" Anna asked. "He's a director of the German Red Cross Ambulance Dogs Association." "Oh," Anna said, feeling a bit embarrassed by her ignorance about Stalling's work. "Ewald often writes about the ambulance dogs and how they help medics locate and recover wounded soldiers on the battlefield." "They must be incredibly brave," Anna said. "And smart," Emmy added. "I've always wanted a dog," Anna said, glancing at Stalling's shepherd, wagging its tail. Emmy nudged Anna with her elbow. "Maybe you and Bruno will get one after the war." "That would be lovely," she said. Emmy stood and brushed breadcrumbs from her apron. "I should get back to work." "I'll be there in a moment," Anna said. Emmy nodded and went inside. Anna left the bench and stood in the garden, observing the trio maneuver over the grounds. She admired the gentle manner in which Dr. Stalling walked with his patient, and the obedient behavior of the dog padding alongside him. Most of all, her heart ached for the blind.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?